Before tonight's journey begins, let me know where you're listening from. Now settle in, let your shoulders soften, let your breathing slow, and allow the day to drift quietly away. Tonight we travel to London. In November of 1910. To the cobbled lanes of Borough High Street, where the gas lamps flicker to life one by one against the grey dusk. Among them is Arthur Pendleton, a Lowe's 58-year-old lamplighter, carrying the long brass-tipped pole, one worn leather satchel, and the quiet ache of a bedroom that has been too still for 3 years. He expects only the comfort of a familiar round. But tonight, on the corner of Clink Street, a stooped figure waits beside an old clock, a man who winds time by hand and knows that light is but a pause in the dark. This is the story of Arthur Pendleton and of Nout. One autumn night, when a lamplighter, who has measured his life in patient steps, discovers that the longest round is not the one through the streets, but the one within. So close your eyes, breathe gently, and let the clatter of a horse-drawn cab carry you through gaslight and sleep. Arthur Pendleton stood in the narrow hallway of his flat above a baker's shop on Little Britain Street, the last of the afternoon light pooling through the frosted glass of the transom window. He had lived here for 19 years, through the good years and the quiet ones, through the years when Sarah's footsteps had been the rhythm of the floorboards, and through the years since she had gone, when the boards had learned a slower, heavier tread. His hand found the brass hook by the door where his lamplighter's pole hung, a slender shaft of ashwood tipped with a brass fitting that held a small wick and a reservoir of oil. He had carried this same pole for 22 years, had replaced the wick a dozen times, had worn the brass to a soft, dull gleam where his fingers curled. The leather satchel lay on the hall table beside it, a square pouch with brass buckles, patched at one corner, containing 4 spare wicks, a small bottle of lamp oil, a rag, and a box of lucifer matches. He touched each item as he packed it, not from necessity, for his hands knew their weight without thought, but from something older, something that had become habit in the weeks after Sarah's funeral, when every motion had needed a deliberate anchor to keep him from drifting. He pulled on his heavy wool coat, the one with the worn collar that smelled faintly of coal smoke and damp wool, and settled his cap low over his brow. The cap was of dark blue serge, with a small peak that cast a shadow over his eyes, and inside the band, sewn with uneven stitches, was a scrap of Sarah's apron, a faded blue cotton that she had worn when she stood at the stove, stirring soup, humming a tune he could no longer remember fully, only the shape of its melody, like a bent coin in a pocket. Through the thin wall he could hear the baker below, Mr. Griswold, sliding his iron peel into the oven with a soft scrape, and the smell of new bread rose through the floorboards, a warm, yeasty breath that was the only constant in this house since the change had come. Arthur inhaled it slowly, letting the warmth settle in his chest, then turned to the door. The clock on the mantelpiece in the parlor, a walnut case with brass numerals that Sarah had bought from a second-hand shop in Lambeth on their 5th anniversary, struck a single, clear note. 4:30. The sun was already low behind the roofs and chimney pots of London. and soon the first lamps would need his attention. He always began at the southern end of his round, at the junction of Borough High Street and the approach to London Bridge, where the great iron stanchions of the gas lamps stood like sentinels against the slate-colored sky. He stepped out onto the landing, pulled the door shut behind him, and tested the lock with a gentle push of his thumb, a habit born from the night a thief had slipped through a neighbor's window 2 streets over, and from the deeper, quieter fear that he might one day leave the door ajar and return to find the flat empty of everything he held, though he knew no one would take what was left. The only things of value were Sarah's sewing box, still on the windowsill in the bedroom, and the photograph in its silver frame on the sideboard, the one taken at Margate in the summer of 1892, when she had worn a white dress with lace at the collar and laughed at the wind that caught her hair, and he had stood beside her with his hand at her waist, thinking that the world could never be anything but bright. He descended the narrow staircase, his boots making a measured, steady rhythm on the worn treads. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 steps to the ground floor, where the scent of new bread thickened into a sweet, almost edible air. Mr. Griswold, a short man with flour-dusted forearms and a bald crown that caught the light like a polished stone, looked up from his work table as Arthur passed the doorway. "Evening, Mr. Pendleton," he said, wiping a hand on his apron. "Evening, Mr. Griswold." Arthur nodded, and his voice came out softly, as it always did in these hours before the night began, as though the dusk itself demanded a lower register. "First lamp at St. Mary Overy again?" the baker asked, though he knew the answer. "First lamp at St. Mary Overy," Arthur confirmed, and he felt the familiar warmth of a routine that had not changed in all these years, a thread on which the hours were strung like beads on a string. It was a comfort, this repetition, the certainty of the same steps, the same lamps, the same small flames blooming in the twilight, and he held on to it as he pushed open the street door and stepped out into the cool, damp air of the London evening. The street was quiet, the cobblestones dark with the last moisture of an afternoon that had been neither wet nor dry, but something in between, a gray hover of mist that softened the edges of everything. A costermonger's cart was being wheeled back towards the market by a tired man in a flat cap, and from a window above a stationer's shop came the faint glow of a lamp not yet lit, a yellowish warmth behind lace curtains. Arthur pulled his collar tighter, settled the pole over his shoulder, and began to walk. His steps took him past the church of St. Bartholomew the Less, where the ivy had grown thick over the south wall, and then down towards the river, where the smell changed from coal and bread to the metallic, muddy breath of the Thames at low tide. He could hear the water, a low, restless murmur against the wharves, a sound he had known so long that it had become the texture of his nights, like the ticking of the clock in his parlor, or the creak of the stairs when he climbed them at 3 in the morning. The sky above the rooftops was a deep violet, almost blue, with a single star hanging low over the spire of Southwark Cathedral, a star that Sarah had called the Lamplighter's star, because it appeared just as he began his round. He looked at it for a moment and felt something loosen in his chest, a small, quiet yielding, as though the night were welcoming him. Then he turned the corner onto Borough High Street, and the first lamp came into view. Arthur Pendleton's life was measured in small, precise intervals. There was the interval between the striking of 4:30 and the moment he lit the first lamp, approximately 17 minutes of walking, including the pause at the corner to adjust the weight of the satchel. There was the interval between each lamp, 3 minutes and 40 seconds on a clear evening, 4 minutes on a damp one, when the wick took longer to catch. And there was the interval that had settled into his bones like a second skeleton, the hour between 3 and 4 in the morning, when he would wake without warning, his eyes open in the dark, and lie still beneath the coverlet, listening to the silence where Sarah's breathing had once been. He had not slept through the night in 3 years, not once. It had begun the night she died, a pneumonia that had taken her in the small hours of a February morning, the doctor's horse-drawn carriage rattling away into the fog, the house quietening like a shell after the tide has withdrawn. He had sat beside her until the dawn came gray through the curtains, and then he had risen, made a pot of tea he did not drink, and walked to work. That night, and every night since, the hour between 3 and 4 had found him awake. Sometimes he lay still and listened to the sounds of the city, the distant whistle of a goods train at Waterloo, the rumble of a late cab, the cry of a river bird that had lost its way in the darkness. Sometimes he rose and stood at the window, watching the empty street below, the circles of light cast by the gas lamps he had lit hours earlier, and he would count them, 1, 2, 3, as far as the corner, and then another 3 beyond that, and then a 4th beyond the church wall, until his eyes grew tired and he returned to bed. It was not a search for comfort, not exactly. It was more like a habit of the body, a muscle that had learned to clench at a certain hour and would not unclench until the clock struck 4. The flat had its own rhythms. The kettle on the hob, the blue and white teapot that Sarah had brought from her mother's house in Kent, the single cup. He never used 2 cups anymore, though he kept the second one on the shelf, a thin bone china cup with a chip in the rim, as if to remove it would be to admit that she was never coming back. He ate his meals at the drop-leaf table by the window, bread and cheese, and occasionally a mutton chop from the butcher on Long Lane, and he read the newspaper through to the small ads, and he wound the mantel clock every Sunday morning at exactly 9 o'clock, because Sarah had always wound it on Sundays, and he had taken up the task without thinking, as though her hands had left a groove in the key that his fingers could follow. The Lamplighters of London had a union hall near Blackfriars, a narrow room above a tobacco shop, where the men gathered once a month to smoke and complain and exchange stories. Arthur attended most meetings, though he rarely spoke. He sat near the back, by the window that looked out over Ludgate Circus, and listened to the younger men argue about wages and shift hours, and the new electric lights that were beginning to appear in the West End. White, steady lights that hummed and did not flicker, that did not need a man to walk from lamp to lamp with a pole and a flame. They spoke of them as a threat, an ending, but Arthur found he could not feel the same alarm. The electric lights were different, yes, but they were not his. His were the yellow, dancing flames that leaned into the wind and threw long shadows across the cobbles, that hissed faintly when the rain fell on the hot glass, that burned with a heart as old as the city itself. He had been a lamplighter since he was 36, after a decade as a clerk in a shipping office near St. Catherine Docks, a job that had paid better, but had left him sitting still for 10 hours a day, his eyes on ledgers, his fingers stained with ink. He had taken it up after a doctor told him he needed more fresh air, and he had never gone back. The walking was part of him now, the rhythm of it, the way his legs knew each curb and cobble, the way his shoulders remembered the weight of the pole, as though it were an extension of his arm. He knew the streets of his round better than he knew his own face in the mirror, the loose drain cover on Bankside that croaked like a frog when a cart rolled over it, the scent of roasting coffee from the warehouse on Park Street, the particular tilt of the pavement in front of the George Inn, where generations of feet had worn the stone into a shallow dish. And he knew the people, the night watchman at the brewery who always raised a hand in greeting, the elderly woman in the first-floor flat on High Timber Street who left her lamp unlit because she said she preferred the dark, the cats that belonged to no one and everyone, slipping through the alleyways like small, watchful spirits. And he knew their routines as they knew his, and there was a comfort in that mutual recognition, the sense that the night had a shape, a structure, a gentle order that did not change. But the hour between 3 and 4 remained outside that order. It was a space in time that belonged to no one, a pocket of silence where the world seemed to pause, and Arthur would lie in the dark, his hands folded on his chest, and feel the weight of the years pressing down on him like a stone. He would think of Sarah's hands, how they had been thin and veined in her last months, how she had pressed them against his cheek and said, "You'll be all right, Arthur. You'll find your way." And he had believed her, because he had always believed her. But the way had not appeared. The path had simply continued, one lamp after another, one night after another, and the hour had remained empty. He pushed the thought away now, as he stood before the first lamp on Borough High Street, the brass fitting cool in his hand. He lifted the pole, tilted it with a practiced twist, and touched the small flame at its tip to the gas jet inside the glass. A rush of yellow light, and the lamp was alive, a warm, pulsing glow that spread across the street, catching the edges of the cobblestones and the iron railing of the churchyard. Arthur adjusted the flame, stepped back, and allowed himself a single, quiet breath. 23 more lamps to go. He lifted the pole and walked on. His route was a loop of 24 lamps, each one named in his mind not by the street, but by its own character. The tall one at the corner of the Borough Market that seemed to lean slightly to the east, as though perpetually listening for something. The squat one outside the Hop Exchange that had a dent in its collar from a runaway cart in 1903. The pair on the approach to London Bridge that stood so close together that their light overlapped, forming a single pool of gold on the pavement. He had lit these lamps in this order for so many years that his body knew the sequence without needing to consult his thoughts, a kind of walking meditation in which the hours dissolved and only the motion remained. The pole was his constant companion. It was exactly 6 feet and 3 inches long, made of ash wood that had been cut in the Forest of Dean and turned on a lathe in a workshop near Shoe Lane. The brass tip was threaded so that the small oil reservoir and the wick holder could be removed and cleaned, a task Arthur performed every Sunday after breakfast with a piece of chamois leather and a drop of turpentine. The wick was made of a special cotton blend that held the flame steady even in a stiff breeze, and he replaced it once a month, as regular as the rent. When he held the pole, the weight settled into his hand like the handle of an old friend, not too light, not too heavy, perfectly balanced, so that the tip could be guided with the smallest adjustment of his wrist. In the satchel he carried 4 spare wicks, coiled in a tin box to keep them dry, a small bottle of paraffin oil for the reservoir, a flathead screwdriver for tightening the adjustment screw on the gas valve, a rag of soft, unbleached cotton, and the matches, lucifer matches, in a box with a striking strip on the side, printed with a red devil and the words, "The Lucifer Match Company, London." He had used these matches for his entire career, had grown accustomed to the particular scent of phosphorus when a match was struck, the brief, sharp aroma that preceded the flame. He always kept the box in his jacket pocket, close to his chest, so that the matches stayed warm and dry. The technique of lighting a lamp had its own ritual. First, he would approach from the east. He had no reason for this preference, except that it had once seemed natural to be walking into the sunset when he began his round, and the habit had persisted. He would stop at the base of the lamp, rest the pole on his shoulder, and look up at the glass panes, checking for cracks or condensation. Then he would lower the pole, unscrew the small brass cap that protected the wick, and strike a match against the side of the box. A single, clean motion that brought the flame to life. He would hold the match to the wick, wait for the wick to catch, and then adjust the flame by turning a tiny brass knob on the side of the reservoir. When the flame was steady, a small, bright cone of yellow at the end of the pole, he would lift the pole again, guiding it through the small opening at the base of the lamp, and touch the flame to the gas jet. The gas would light with a soft puff. and he would withdraw the pole, turn off the wick, and watch for a moment as the gas flame settled into its own steady rhythm. Then he would move on. He had timed this process over the years, in idle moments when his mind wandered. From the strike of the match to the lighting of the gas took exactly 43 seconds, if all went well. If the wick needed adjusting, it might take a minute and a quarter. He never hurried, because there was no need to hurry. The lamps did not care when they were lit, only that they were lit, and the city did not care either. The people who passed beneath them did not look up, did not notice the flame that had been carried from the match to the gas by a man with a pole and a satchel. But Arthur noticed. He noticed each lamp as an individual, a living thing that had its own moods. The way the flame danced in a sharp wind, the way the glass cast a soft, watery light on the wet pavement, the way the metal creaked as it cooled in the night air. He had once tried to explain this to a fellow lamplighter named Tom Henshaw over a glass of porter in the Duke of Clarence. Tom had laughed and said, "It's just a lamp, Arthur. You light it, you move on. It's not a friend." But Arthur had not laughed. He had nodded, finished his porter, and walked home through the gaslit streets, counting each lamp as he passed, letting the light fall on his face, and he had known that Tom was wrong. The lamps were not friends, not exactly, but they were something. They were a continuity, a thread that connected his evenings to the evenings of the men who had come before him, the men who had lit these same lamps in the years before he was born, their hands on similar poles, their eyes watching the same flames. He reached the fourth lamp now, the one outside the Church of St. Saviour's, and paused to adjust a stubborn gas valve that had been stiff for a week. He worked the screwdriver into the slot, gave it a quarter turn, and heard the gas hiss softly through the jet. The flame caught, flared, and settled. He put the screwdriver away, wiped his fingers on the rag, and looked up at the church tower, where the clock showed 5:15. The stars were emerging, a handful of them scattered across the deepening sky, like grains of salt dropped on a dark cloth, and the air had grown colder, carrying the sharp, mineral smell of the river. He had been walking for 45 minutes. Another hour and a half, and the whole round would be complete. He would cross the river at Southwark Bridge, circle back through the alleys of the Bankside, and finish at the lamp outside his own front door, the 24th, the one he always lit last, because it was the one that lit his way home. He lifted the pole, settled it on his shoulder, and walked on into the night. He had never ridden a sleeper train. He had never been on any train further than the Greenwich line, a short journey southeast of London that he had taken once, years ago, with Sarah, to watch the ships pass through the Thames barrier. But the phrase came to him now as he walked, unbidden, because his round felt like a sleeper train, a slow, steady movement through the dark, with the lamps as windows that opened one by one onto the night. The city was his carriage, and the hours were the tracks, and he was the only passenger who stayed awake from the first station to the last. He passed the corner of Clink Street. Here the road narrowed, the buildings leaning inwards as if to share a secret, and the cobblestones were uneven, worn by centuries of feet and wheels. A set of iron gates marked the entrance to the old Clink prison, now a warehouse for leather and hides, and the air here carried a thick, tannic scent that mixed with the damp of the river. A single lamp hung on a bracket attached to the gate, and Arthur paused to light it, his breath clouding in the chill. As he worked, he heard a sound from the deep shadow of a recessed doorway, a soft, rhythmic tick-tick-tick, like the beat of a small clock, but irregular, as though the clock were limping. He turned his head, but the sound stopped, and he saw only the faint outline of a man sitting on a wooden crate, his hands busy with something small and metallic. Arthur could not make out the face, only the silhouette of a cap and a pair of spectacles that caught the light of the newly lit lamp. "Evening," said Arthur, his voice carrying the usual measured greeting he offered to the late-night city. The figure did not answer immediately, but the small object in his hands stopped moving, and the tick-tick ceased. Then a voice, low and slightly rough, like the sound of a key turning in an old lock, said, "Evening, Lamplighter. You're early tonight." Arthur blinked. He was not early. He was exactly on time, the same time he had been for 22 years, within a minute or two. "I think not, sir. 5:30, same as always." "5:30 on your clock, maybe," said the voice, and the figure shifted, rising slowly from the crate, brushing a hand over his coat. "But 5:30 on mine is a different matter altogether. Time is not the same in every house, you know. It leaks, it waits, it sometimes runs backwards for a few minutes when the pendulum swings just right." Arthur stepped closer, curious despite himself. The man was older than him, perhaps in his late 60s or early 70s, with a face that looked as though it had been carved from oak, deep lines around the eyes and mouth, a nose that had been broken at least once, and a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles held together at the bridge with a twist of copper wire. In his hands he held a pocket watch, its back open, revealing a maze of gears and springs and tiny brass screws. The man's fingers were stained with oil, and the nails were short, clean, and steady. "You're a clockmaker," said Arthur. "I am," said the man. "Albert Moss. I have a shop a few doors down, but I keep my bench here in the summer, when the light is better. Winter, too, if it's dry enough. I like the noise of the street. It reminds me that time is not just a thing in a case, but a thing that moves through the world." He gestured with the open watch. "This one's stubborn. A Waterbury, American-made. The mainspring is worn, and the balance wheel has a hairline crack. I've been coaxing it back to life for 3 days." He held out the watch, and Arthur took it, turning it carefully in his fingers. The face was enamel, with black Roman numerals, and the hands were blued steel, delicate and elegant. The back was open, and Arthur could see the intricate mechanism, the tiny wheels, the coiled spring, the jeweled bearings that glittered like pinpricks of light. He had never held a watch like this, never looked so closely at the machinery of time. He thought of his own clock at home, the walnut case that Sarah had bought, and how he wound it every Sunday, without ever looking inside, without ever knowing what made it tick. "You can hear it, can't you?" said Albert. "The heartbeat of the thing." Arthur listened. The watch was not ticking. He held it to his ear, and there was only silence. "It isn't working," he said. "Ah, but it is," said Albert, and he smiled, a slow, gentle smile that deepened the lines around his eyes. "It's ticking inside itself. The outer shell of time is broken, but the inner time, the real time, is still moving. It just hasn't found a way to show you yet. That's what I do, Lamplighter. I help the inner time find a way out." Arthur handed the watch back, his fingers brushing the warm brass. "I don't think I understand." "No reason you should," said Albert, and he tucked the watch into a leather waistcoat pocket. "It's a clockmaker's talk, but you'll understand before the night is out, I can tell. You have the look of a man who is ready to listen to the interior chime." He nodded once, then sat back down on the crate, and the silence returned, broken only by the distant murmur of the river. Arthur stood for a long moment, feeling the weight of the pole in his hand, the cold air on his cheeks, the faint sense that something had shifted, like a wheel that had been jammed, and had suddenly, silently, come free. Then he turned, touched the brim of his cap, and walked on. But as he moved away, he heard the sound, tick, 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 begin again, slow, uncertain, like a child learning to walk. The walk from Clink Street to the river edge took him past the remains of the old Winchester Palace, where a rose window still stood in a wall that had no roof. a round stone lacework against the dark sky. Arthur glanced at it as he passed, as he always did, noting how the last light of dusk caught the carvings, turning the stone to a pale, soft gray. He had never entered the ruins. They were closed to the public, and he had never thought to ask permission. But he knew every stone from the outside, how the mortar had crumbled in places, how the ivy had climbed over the sill of the broken window, like a green hand reaching for something it could not hold. Beyond the palace, the ground fell away to the riverbank, and the full breadth of the Thames opened before him. The tide was low, and the water lay flat and dark, reflecting the lights of the warehouses on the south bank and the distant glow of the city beyond. A barge was moored at the wharf, its iron hull black against the water, and a single lantern swung from its mast, casting a pool of yellowish light that trembled on the surface. The air here was colder, carrying the taste of salt and mud and something organic, like the breath of a sleeping creature. The seventh lamp of his round stood at the head of the wharf, a tall iron pillar with a ladder of rungs welded to its side for maintenance. Arthur set down his satchel, rested the pole against his shoulder, and began the climb. He had done this 1,000 times, but he never rushed. The rungs were cold through his gloves, and the iron was slick with the damp, and a fall from this height would break a leg or worse. He climbed slowly, counting the rungs under his breath. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 14, until he reached the platform, where the glass lamp housing was just level with his chest. He struck a match, lit the wick, and reached up to the gas jet. The flame caught, and the lamp bloomed into life, casting a wide circle of light over the wharf, the barge, the river edge. He looked down at the scene from his perch, the piles of timber stacked on the quay, the coil of rope hanging from a bollard, the shadow of a cat that slipped along the edge of the water, and he felt, as he often did in these seconds of stillness, a profound sense of belonging. He was not a man above the city. He was a man inside its fabric, a thread woven through the night. And he descended, his boots finding the rungs with practiced ease, and retrieved his satchel. The bargeman, a broad-shouldered figure in a pea coat and a woolen cap, was standing at the rail, smoking a pipe, the bowl of which glowed red when he drew on it. "Good evening," said Arthur, by way of greeting. "Evening," said the bargeman, his voice carrying the rough edge of a man who had spent years shouting over wind and water. "You're the lamplighter from the Borough side. I've seen you before. Every night, same time, rain or shine." "That's right." "It's a steady job," said the bargeman, as though he were thinking aloud. "I like steady. The river's steady too, in its own way. You think it's moving, but it's always the same, just different water." Arthur nodded, not because he fully understood, but because the words felt right in the quiet of the night. He looked at the river, at the slow, dark current that seemed to slide past without sound, and he thought of all the water that had passed this point since he had first started lighting the lamp here. 22 years of water, enough to fill the entire city, enough to drown every sorrow, if sorrows could be drowned. They could not, of course. Sorrows floated. They drifted on the surface, catching the light, refusing to sink. "You ever been out on a barge?" the man asked. "No," said Arthur, "never." "You should, one day. It's different out there. The city looks like a necklace of lights, and you don't hear the traffic, only the water and the ropes. You should try it, Lamplighter." Arthur considered the invitation, though he knew he would not accept it. The river was not his place. His place was the street, the lamp, the steady pace of the round. But he felt a flicker of curiosity, a small warmth at the thought of seeing the city from the water, of watching his own lamps from a different angle. "Perhaps," he said. The bargeman nodded and returned to his pipe, and Arthur lifted his pole and continued along the wharf, past the stacks of timber and the coiled ropes, towards the next lamp, which stood at the corner of a narrow lane that led to the old Falcon Dock. The lane was quiet, lined with warehouses whose upper windows were dark, their lower shutters barred. A single figure, a woman in a shawl, hurried past with a basket over her arm, her footsteps echoing on the cobbles. Arthur stepped aside to let her pass, and she gave him a small, tired smile, the kind that was offered to a stranger in the dark, and then she was gone, and the lane was empty again. He lit the 8th lamp, then the 9th, then the 10th, each with the same careful precision, the same quiet reverence. By the time he reached the 11th, the moon had risen, a thin crescent that hung above the power station on the opposite bank, its light so faint that it did not compete with the gas lamps, only added a softer, silver layer to the gold. He was halfway through his round now, and the night had settled into a deep, steady hum. The sounds of the city muted, the air still, the darkness, a blanket that wrapped around him like a familiar coat. Past the Falcon Dock, the streets became a labyrinth of narrow alleys and passages that twisted between the warehouses and tenements, their names inscribed on faded enamel signs. Horsley Down Lane, Pickford's Alley, 3-Ton Court. These were the arteries of the old city, the secret routes that only the night workers knew, where the cobblestones were worn smooth and the walls leaned so close that a man could touch both sides with his outstretched arms. Arthur entered Pickford's Alley, his boots finding the familiar dip where the drain had been replaced 3 winters ago. The air here was different, thicker, warmer, carrying the scent of boiling cabbages from a downstairs kitchen, the faint drift of tobacco from an open window, the musty smell of damp plaster and old wood. A cat sat on a windowsill, watching him with unblinking yellow eyes, and he nodded to it as he passed, a small gesture of recognition that he offered to all the cats he met. The 12th lamp was at the far end of the alley, next to a wooden sign that advertised a lodging house called The Anchor. The lamp here was older than the others, its ironwork decorated with a scroll motif, the glass panes held in place by lead frames that had been soldered and resoldered a dozen times. Arthur lit it carefully, the flame catching with a tiny sputter, and as the light spread, he noticed that the door of the lodging house was slightly ajar, and that a man in a nightcap was standing in the gap, peering out at him. "That you, Mr. Pendleton?" the man said, his voice thick with sleep. "Yes, Mr. Guthrie, it's me." Right on time as always. I tell the wife, "You can set your watch by that lamplighter," and she does. She sets it by the light coming through the curtain. When she sees your lamp, she knows it's time to put the kettle on. "I'm glad to be of use," said Arthur, and he meant it. There was a quiet satisfaction in being part of the routine of others, a link in a chain of small, domestic rituals that stretched from one evening to the next. "You want a cup of tea, Mr. Pendleton? I've got the pot on now." Arthur hesitated. He had never accepted such an invitation before, preferring to keep his round uninterrupted. But the night was cold, and the warmth of the lodging-house kitchen was a real and present temptation, and something, perhaps the memory of Albert Moss and the ticking watch, perhaps the bargeman's words about the river, made him pause a moment longer than he usually would. "Thank you, Mr. Guthrie," he said. "I won't stay long, but a cup would be welcome." He leaned his pole against the wall, tucked his satchel under his arm, and stepped through the door into a narrow hallway that smelled of coal and boiled milk. Mr. Guthrie led him to a small kitchen at the back, where a fire glowed in the grate and a kettle sat on a hob, its spout sending up a thin plume of steam. A woman, Mrs. Guthrie, presumably, was sitting at the table, darning a sock by the light of a paraffin lamp, and she looked up with a smile that was kind and slightly weary. "Sit down, Mr. Pendleton," she said, gesturing to a chair. "You must be frozen." He sat, removing his cap and setting it on his knee, and took the cup that Mr. Guthrie handed him. The tea was strong and sweet, with a hint of something herbal, perhaps mint, perhaps chamomile, and it warmed him from the inside out, loosening the stiffness in his shoulders. He drank it slowly, letting the silence of the kitchen settle around him, punctuated only by the ticking of a small mantel clock and the occasional hiss of the fire. "You've been doing this a long time, haven't you?" said Mrs. Guthrie, not looking up from her darning. 22 years, said Arthur. And before that, he told her, briefly, about the shipping office and the ledgers and the doctor's advice about fresh air. She nodded, as though this were exactly the story she had expected, and then she said, "It must be a lonely life, walking the streets all night." Arthur considered the question. "I don't think of it as lonely. There are the cats, and the people who speak to me from their doorways, and the lamps themselves. They keep me company. But no one at home?" The question hung in the air, simple and sharp. He could have answered differently, could have said that his wife had passed, that he lived alone, that the flat was quiet, but the words caught in his throat, and he only shook his head. Mrs. Guthrie did not press. She finished the sock, held it up to the light, and tucked it into a basket by her chair. "Well, you're welcome here any time, Mr. Pendleton. The kettle's always on." He finished his tea, thanked them both, and stepped back out into the alley, where the lamp he had lit was still burning steadily. The cold air hit him like a second skin, and he pulled his collar tighter, retrieved his pole, and continued on his way, past the lodging house, past the closed shutters of a fishmonger's, past a stack of wooden crates that had been left out for the morning. The 13th lamp was in a courtyard behind a pub called the George, a quiet, cobbled space where the sound of voices from the bar was softened by the thick stone walls. He lit it, and as the flame caught, he saw his reflection in the dark glass of a window, a tall, thin figure in a cap and a heavy coat, carrying a pole that threw a double shadow in the combined light of the lamp and the moon. He looked at his reflection for a long moment, and he wondered what Sarah would have seen if she had been standing there beside him. Would she have seen the same man who had left the flat 22 years ago, younger and lighter, with a spring in his step and a future that stretched out like an unlit street? Or would she have seen someone else, someone worn, someone quiet, someone whose nights had become a long, slow round that led nowhere but back to the same door, the same silence, the same hour between 3 and 4? He did not have an answer. He only knew that the reflection was his, and that he was still walking, and that the night was deep and the lamps were waiting. He lifted the pole, turned the corner, and pressed on. He did not intend to return to Clink Street. His route curved away from the river after the courtyard, towards the market and the approach to the bridge, and he had no reason to double back. But as he walked, the image of Albert Moss and the open watch lingered in his mind. The empty case, the silent gears, the phrase about inner time waiting for a way out. He had not understood it fully, but it had lodged itself in his thoughts like a splinter, small and persistent, and it kept him from settling into the usual rhythm of the round. He reached the 14th lamp at the corner of Park Street and lit it with his usual care, but his attention was elsewhere, his hands moving by memory. The gas caught, the flame rose, and he moved on, but instead of continuing towards the bridge, he turned left, down a narrow passage that led back towards the river, towards the old Clink gates, towards the sense that he had something to uncover. The passage was dark, the only light coming from a distant lamp on the main road, and Arthur walked carefully, one hand on the wall to guide himself. The stone was cold and damp, and here and there it gave way to iron doors with heavy bolts, and he could hear the scuttling of rats in the shadows, a sound he had learned to ignore. At the end of the passage, the shape of the old prison gates emerged, and beyond them, the crate where Albert had sat, but the crate was empty. He stopped, looking around. The street was quiet. The lamp on the gate burned steadily, casting its circle of light on the cobbles. But there was no sign of the clockmaker. Arthur felt a strange pang of disappointment, as though he had been expecting something, though he could not say what. Then he heard it, a faint, irregular tick-tick, coming from the doorway of a ground-floor room a few steps away. The door was open, and through the gap he could see a dim glow, the yellow light of a tallow candle. He approached, his boots careful on the stones, and looked inside. It was a small workshop, no bigger than a pantry, lined with shelves that held clocks of every size and shape, some tall and wooden, their pendulums still, some small and brass, their faces clouded with age, some that had no cases at all, their exposed mechanisms mounted on wooden stands. A workbench ran along the wall, cluttered with tools, tweezers, tiny screwdrivers, a magnifying glass on a brass stand, a bowl of springs and pins, a jar of oil with a feather floating in it, and in the center of the bench, under the glow of the candle, sat Albert Moss, his hands poised over the open Waterbury watch, his spectacles catching the light. He looked up as Arthur entered, and his eyes, pale blue, with a gentleness that seemed to hold no surprise, met his. "Ah," he said, "the Lamplighter. I had a feeling you would find your way here." Arthur took off his cap, held it in his hands. "I don't know why I came. The street wasn't part of my round." "There are no rounds that are not part of something larger," said Albert, and he gestured to a stool beside the bench. "Sit, if you like. I'm almost finished coaxing the inner time out of this one." Arthur sat, folding his hands over the satchel on his knee, and watched. Albert's fingers moved with a precision that seemed almost musical. A delicate pressure here, a nudge there, a tiny puff of breath to clear a speck of dust from the balance wheel. He worked in silence, and Arthur felt the minutes pass in a way he had not experienced before. Not counted, not marked, but simply flowing, like the water of the river under the barge. Finally, Albert straightened, placed the watch in a small brass holder, and picked up a fine needle. He touched it to an invisible place in the mechanism, and there was a click, and then the watch began to tick, a steady, even rhythm, like a heartbeat made audible. "There," said Albert, and he held it up. "Hear that? That's time, moving again. It was always there, just waiting for someone to help it find the way out." He handed the watch to Arthur, who took it and held it to his ear. The ticking was soft but clear, and it seemed to fill his entire head, drowning out the distant sounds of the city, the creak of the old building, the faint whisper of his own breath. "How did you know?" Arthur asked. "Know what?" "That the time was still there, inside." Albert took off his spectacles, rubbed the lenses on his sleeve, and put them back on. He looked at Arthur with a gaze that was both sharp and kind, like the edge of a tool that had been used for 100 years. "Because I've been doing this a long time," he said, "and I've learned that nothing really stops. Things pause, sometimes. They rest. They gather themselves. They wait. But they don't end. The energy is still there. It just needs a way to move again. That's all I do. I open a path." Arthur looked down at the watch in his palm, the second hand now sweeping in its unceasing circuit, and he thought of the hour between 3 and 4, of the long, silent stillness that had settled over his life, of the many nights he had lain awake, waiting for something that had not come. "What about people?" he said, his voice low. "Do they pause too, and wait for someone to open a path?" Albert was silent for a long moment. He turned the watch over in his hands, then set it on the bench, and when he spoke, his voice was very soft. "Yes," he said, "they do. But the path doesn't always look like a door, or a key, or a clockmaker's needle. Sometimes it looks like a lamp being lit, night after night, by a man who doesn't know that he is the one opening the path, not for himself, but for all the people whose windows he passes, whose sleep he guards with a small, steady flame. Arthur did not speak. He let the words settle, like sediment in a glass, and the workshop fell quiet, except for the ticking of the Waterbury and the gentle breathing of the two men, one old, one older, both waiting for the night to unfold. Arthur sat on the stool, the Waterbury watch warm in his palm, its ticking, a small, persistent presence against his skin. He did not look up at Albert, but at the array of clocks on the shelves, some with pendulums frozen mid-swing, some with hands that had not moved in years, all gathered in the dim light of the workshop, like patients in a quiet ward, waiting for the physician to make his rounds. "How long have you been here?" Arthur asked, his voice low, the words feeling like an intrusion into the stillness. "In this room, or in this place?" Albert's hands moved to a small brass carriage clock, its casing dented, its face cracked. He picked it up, turned it over, and set it gently on its side. "I've been on Clink Street for nearly 40 years. Before that, I had a shop near Bermondsey, but the river air was too damp for the clocks. They complained. A clock, you see, will tell you when it is unhappy. It stops, or it runs too fast, or it ticks with a little catch in its voice, like a man who has been walking too long and needs to rest his feet." Arthur smiled, a small, tired thing. "I didn't know clocks could complain." "They can. They are not so different from us. They have springs and gears, and we have lungs and hearts, but the principle is the same. Something drives us forward, and something holds us back. The balance is everything." Albert set the carriage clock down and reached for a tall, wooden long-case clock that stood against the wall, its pendulum still, its face blank. The hands had been removed. "This one came to me from a house in Kent, after the owner passed. The family said it had not run in 30 years. They thought it was broken, but it was not broken. It was simply waiting for someone to understand what it was trying to say." Arthur looked at the clock, its case of dark oak, its brass fittings dulled with age. What was it trying to say? That it had been wound too tightly, for too long. The spring was under constant tension, never allowed to relax. It had forgotten how to let go, so I took the hands off and I let it sit. I let it breathe. For the first year, it did nothing. Then, slowly, it began to move, not to tell time, but to settle. The spring relaxed. The gears found their old positions. And after 3 years, I put the hands back on, and it began to run again, as if it had never stopped. Arthur listened, the watch in his hand still ticking, the rhythm steady and even. He thought of the hours between 3 and 4, of the tension that had wound itself into his chest, of the years of lying awake, waiting for something to release. "I have been wound too tightly," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them, and he felt the weight of the admission settle in the air between them. Albert did not look at him. He did not nod, or smile, or offer any sign of acknowledgement. He simply picked up a tiny screwdriver, fitted it into a screw on the carriage clock, and turned it a quarter of a revolution. "Yes," he said, "I know. It is written in the way you hold your shoulders, in the way you walk, in the way you look at a watch, as though it were a stranger you are trying to remember." Arthur felt a flush of something, shame, or recognition, or both. He had thought his grief was invisible, a private thing carried in the dark of his coat. But here, in this small room, under the gaze of a man who had spent 40 years listening to the complaints of clocks, it had been seen. "I lost my wife," Arthur said, and the words were simple, plain, without the ornament of tears. 3 years ago, Sarah, she was the one who kept the time of our house. She knew when to wake, when to sleep, when to eat, when to sit in the garden and watch the light fade. After she was gone, I did not know how to keep time anymore. I only knew how to keep the round. Albert set the screwdriver down and turned to face Arthur, his pale blue eyes steady, his hands still on the workbench. The round is a kind of time, he said. It is a rhythm. It is a way of moving through the hours when the hours have lost their meaning. There is nothing wrong with that. But a rhythm that never changes is not a rhythm. It is a cage, and a cage, even a comfortable one, will eventually stop the heart from moving. Arthur looked down at the watch. The second hand swept past the 12, past the 1, past the 2, and he watched it for a long moment, counting the seconds in his head, feeling the shape of time passing. "How do I let go?" he asked, and the question was so small, so quiet, he was not sure he had spoken it aloud. Albert did not answer immediately. He picked up a small, round clock, no larger than a pocket watch, and held it close to his ear. He listened for a long time, his eyes half closed, his lips parted slightly, as though he were hearing a distant music. Then he set it down and looked at Arthur. "You do not need to let go," he said. "You need to let move. The energy is still there, Arthur. It has not gone anywhere. It is waiting, like the spring in a clock that has been wound too tight, for someone to open a path and let it run. You are the one who opens the path. You have been doing it every night, with every lamp you light, but you have not yet opened the path for yourself." Arthur sat in the silence, the ticking of the Waterbury watch, the distant creak of the old building, the soft breath of the candle flame, all of it weaving together into a sound that was not noise, but a kind of quiet, a kind of stillness that held the promise of movement. He looked at the long case clock without hands, and he thought of Sarah, of the way she had held his hand in the final hours, of the way she had looked at him with eyes that were not afraid, of the way she had said, "Arthur, you will be all right. You will find your way back to the light." He had not believed her then, but sitting in the clockmaker's workshop, with the watch in his hand and the old man's words settling into his chest, he began to wonder if perhaps she had been right. Arthur left the workshop an hour later, the Waterbury watch in his pocket, its ticking a companion against his thigh. Albert had not asked him to leave, but the round was unfinished, and the lamps were waiting, and he knew that he had to return to the rhythm of the night, if only to feel the shape of it one more time. He walked towards the river, his steps slower than before, his eyes noticing things he had not seen on the earlier passes, the way the moonlight caught the edge of a broken sign, the way the cobbles gleamed with a thin film of moisture, the way the distant sound of a barge horn seemed to hang in the air like a thread of silk. The city was still, but it was not silent. It hummed with a low, continuous vibration, the sound of water and wind, and the slow breathing of a million sleeping people. He reached the end of Clink Street, where the old gates opened onto the riverside, and he stopped. The Thames was dark, almost black, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple of a passing boat or the splash of a fish. The lights of Southwark Bridge flickered in the distance, a string of small, warm points that seemed to float above the water, and on the opposite bank, the towers of the city rose in shadow, their windows dark, their chimneys sending thin trails of smoke into the night sky. Arthur leaned against the stone wall, his satchel at his feet, his pole resting against the iron railing. He had known this view for 22 years, had seen it in every season, in every weather, in every state of light and dark, but tonight it looked different. The water seemed deeper, the shadows longer, the silence more alive. He could feel the river moving, a slow, endless current that carried with it the debris of the city, a piece of wood, a glass bottle, a dead leaf, all of it drifting towards the sea, towards the place where all things eventually arrived. He thought of the watch in his pocket, of the ticking that had not stopped, of the path that Albert had opened for the small, coiled spring, and he thought of the path that he himself had not yet opened, the one that would allow his own energy to move, to flow, to find its way out of the cage of the round. He did not know what that path looked like. He did not know if it was a door, a key, or a clockmaker's needle, but he knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that it was there, waiting for him, somewhere in the darkness of the night. He picked up his pole, shouldered his satchel, and continued along the river towards the next lamp, which stood at the corner of a narrow alley called Pickle Herring Street. The lamp was old, its glass cracked, its frame blackened by years of smoke and rain. He lit it with the same careful motion, the same steady hand, but as he stepped back, he noticed something he had not seen before, a small, handwritten sign, tacked to the wall beside the lamp, its paper yellowed and curled at the edges. The sign read, "For those who walk in the dark, the light is a promise. For those who light the lamp, the dark is a gift." He did not know who had written it or how long it had been there, but the words settled into his thoughts, and he repeated them to himself as he moved on, his steps carrying him along the river, past the warehouses, past the coal wharves, past the narrow stairs that led down to the water's edge. The 15th lamp was at the entrance to a small wooden dock where a single barge was moored, its deck dark, its mast bare. The lamp was set on a post, its light casting a small circle on the planks of the dock, and as Arthur approached, he saw a figure sitting on the edge of the dock, legs dangling over the water, the shape of a man in a heavy coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He slowed his steps, the pole held loosely in his hand, and he called out, his voice carrying across the still water, "Good evening." The figure turned, and Arthur saw the face of a man in his 60s, with a gray beard and eyes that were the color of the river itself, dark, deep, and full of movement. The man smiled, a slow, warm thing, and he gestured to the space beside him on the dock. "Good evening," he said. "I was wondering if anyone would come. The lamp has been dark for 3 nights, and I have been waiting for someone to bring it back to life." Arthur stepped onto the dock, his boots careful on the wet planks, and he set the pole down, unscrewed the cap of the oil can, and began the work of cleaning the lamp, his hands moving with the same practiced ease. "The lamp keeper has been ill," he said. "I am standing in for him tonight." "Ah," said the man, "a stand-in. That explains the new face. I have been watching the lamps on this stretch for 15 years, and I know every one of them. The one at the corner of Pickle Herring, the one at the gate of the distillery, and this one, here, at the dock. They are like old friends, those lamps. I would miss them if they were gone." Arthur finished cleaning the lamp, struck a match, and lit the wick. The flame caught, rose, and settled into a steady glow, casting a warm light across the dock, across the water, across the face of the man on the edge. "There," said Arthur, "it is lit again." The man nodded, and he looked at the flame with a kind of reverence. "Thank you," he said. "I am a pilot, by trade. I guide ships up and down the river, through the narrows and the shallows, through the fog and the rain. And I have learned that the most important thing in the dark is a single point of light. It does not need to be bright. It only needs to be steady. That is enough to bring a ship home." Arthur sat down on the dock, a few feet away, his satchel at his side, his pole resting across his knees. He looked at the water, at the reflection of the lamp, at the dark shape of the barge, and he felt something settle in his chest, a quiet, like the quiet that comes before a storm, but softer, less threatening. The pilot did not speak, and Arthur did not speak, and the two men sat together in the light of the lamp, watching the river, waiting for nothing, and the night moved around them, slow and deep, like the current that carried all things to the sea. The pilot sat on the dock, his legs dangling over the water, his coat wrapped tightly around him against the chill of the river. He had a pipe in his hand, unlit, and he held it between his fingers like a talisman, turning it over and over, the wood worn smooth by years of use. Arthur watched him, the light of the lamp catching the edges of his face, the gray of his beard, the deep lines around his eyes. He was a man who had seen the river in all its moods, who had read the currents and the tides, who had learned to find his way through the fog by the sound of the water against the hull. "How long have you been a pilot?" Arthur asked. The pilot smiled, a slow, thoughtful thing. 42 years. I started as a boy, working on a barge, carrying coal from the collieries up the river. I learned the channels by sight, by sound, by the feel of the water under the keel. And then, when I was old enough, I took the exam and I became a pilot. I have been guiding ships ever since, through the narrows, past the bridges, through the reaches where the river bends and the current turns. It is a good life if you do not mind the dark. Do you? Arthur asked. Mind the dark? The pilot considered the question, his eyes on the water. I used to, he said. When I was young, I was afraid of the dark. I would lie awake at night, listening to the sounds of the house, imagining all the things that might be waiting in the shadows. But the river taught me not to be afraid. The river is dark most of the time, and yet it is full of life. It is full of movement. The dark is not an absence of light. It is a presence of something else, something deeper. Arthur thought of the hours between 3 and 4, of the darkness that had settled over his life, of the way it had seemed like an absence of Sarah, of warmth, of the future he had expected. But the pilot's words made him wonder if perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps the darkness was not empty. Perhaps it was full of something he had not yet learned to see. I lost my wife, Arthur said, and the words came more easily now, as though the darkness of the river had loosened something in his chest. 3 years ago, and ever since, I have been walking through the night, lighting lamps, keeping the rhythm of the round, but I have not known how to stop. I have not known how to let the darkness be something other than a cage. The pilot nodded slowly, his pipe still in his hand, his eyes still on the water. I lost my wife too, he said. 20 years ago. She was a woman who loved the river. She used to sit on the dock, just like this, and watch the boats go by. She said the river was a kind of music, a song that never ended, and she wanted to hear it all the way to the end. Arthur looked at the pilot, and he saw the same grief in his eyes, the same quiet, the same shape of a wound that had healed but not disappeared. How did you go on? He asked. The pilot was silent for a long moment. He turned the pipe over in his hands, and then he spoke, his voice low, the words coming slowly, like the current of the river itself. I did not go on. I went with. I learned to move with the current instead of against it. The river does not ask you to forget. It asks you to let go. It asks you to let the water carry you, even when you do not know where it is going. And I learned, over time, that the current is not a force that takes you away from the one you loved. It is a force that carries you towards the same sea, the same horizon, the same place where all the waters meet. Arthur listened, and he felt the words settle into his chest, into the place where the grief had been, a space that had been empty for so long. He looked at the river, at the dark, moving water, and he thought of Sarah, of her hand in his, of the way she had looked at him in the final hours, of the way she had said, "You will find your way back to the light." He had not understood then, but sitting on the dock, with the pilot beside him, and the lamp glowing above him, he began to understand. The light was not something he had to find. It was something he carried. It was in the lamps he lit, in the round he walked, in the small, steady flame that had been burning in his chest all along. I have been fighting the current, Arthur said, for 3 years, I have been fighting it, and I am tired." The pilot turned to him, and his eyes were kind, the same deep, dark color of the river. "Then stop fighting," he said. "Let the current carry you. You do not have to know where it is going. You only have to trust that it is taking you somewhere you need to be." Arthur sat in the silence, the water lapping against the dock, the lamp hissing softly, the distant sound of a barge horn carrying across the night. And for the first time in 3 years, he felt something loosen in his chest, a small, quiet release, like the first tick of a clock that had been waiting for a path to open. He did not know what would come next. He did not know if the current would carry him home, or to the sea, or to a place he had never seen. But he knew, with a certainty that was both strange and familiar, that he was ready to let it. Arthur stood from the dock, his legs stiff, his joints aching from the cold. The pilot had gone, his shape disappearing into the darkness of the wharf, and Arthur was alone with the lamp in the river. The watch in his pocket ticked, steady and even, and he felt its presence like a small, living thing, a heartbeat that had been given back to itself. He picked up his pole, shouldered his satchel, and began to walk back along the river, towards the bridge, towards the streets that still held the unlit lamps. His steps were slower now, not from fatigue, but from a new kind of attention. He noticed the way the cobbles curved under his boots, the way the air smelled of salt and coal and wet wood, the way the distant lights of the city seemed to pulse like a living thing, breathing in the dark. He reached the entrance to a narrow street, not far from the market, and he saw the lamp that stood at the corner, its glass clouded with grime, its wick low. He approached it, his hands moving through the familiar motions, the cleaning, the trimming, the striking of the match. But as he raised the flame to the wick, he paused. The lamp was not waiting for him. It was waiting for the light, and he was the one who brought it. He thought of the sign on Pickle Herring Street. "For those who walk in the dark, the light is a promise. For those who light the lamp, the dark is a gift." He had not understood it when he had read it, but now, standing in the street, with the match burning down towards his fingers, he felt the meaning of the words in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the flame. He lit the lamp, and the light spread across the cobbles, casting long shadows, filling the small space with a glow that was soft and steady. He stepped back, and he looked at the lamp, and he felt something shift inside him, a subtle movement, like the turning of a gear that had been stuck for a long time. He did not know if it was the beginning of something or the end. He only knew that the path was open and that he was walking through it. He continued his round, moving from street to street, from lamp to lamp, but the rhythm of the work was different now. It was no longer a cage, it was a dance. His feet found a new tempo, a slower, more deliberate step, and his hands moved with a gentleness that had not been there before. He was not just lighting the lamps, he was tending to them, caring for them, opening a path for the light to flow. The hour grew late, the streets grew quieter, and the city settled into the deep stillness of the night. Arthur reached the last lamp on his round, a small, iron lamp that stood at the foot of the bridge, its light casting a faint glow on the stone arches. He lit it, and as the flame caught, he felt a weariness settle over him, not the heavy, aching weariness of the round, but a soft, willing weariness, the kind that comes at the end of a long day, when the body is ready to rest. He stood at the foot of the bridge, looking out over the river, the water dark and still, the lights of the city flickering in the distance. The watch in his pocket ticked, and he listened to it, not as a marker of time, but as a reminder of the path that had been opened. He did not know where he would sleep that night. He did not know if he would return to the flat on Long Lane, or if he would find a bench by the river, or if he would simply walk until the dawn came. But he knew, with a certainty that was quiet and deep, that he was ready to let the current carry him. He tucked his pole under his arm, adjusted his satchel, and began to walk, not towards the next lamp, but towards the dark, towards the river, towards the place where the current would take him. And as he walked, he felt the first stirrings of sleep, a gentle pull, like the tide turning, like the water rising, like the slow, inevitable approach of the morning. Sleep came, but not as Arthur had expected. It did not arrive with a sudden weight, or a closing of the eyes, or a surrender to the dark. It came slowly, like the tide rising over a flat shore, inch by inch, unnoticed until the water was already there. He had walked to the edge of the river, to a bench that overlooked the water, and he had sat down, his satchel at his feet, his pole resting across his knees. The watch in his pocket ticked, but the sound was distant now, muffled by the fold of his coat, and he did not count the seconds or the minutes. He simply sat, watching the water, feeling the cool air on his face, listening to the small sounds of the night, the creak of a mooring rope, the ripple of a fish, the distant call of a night bird. The tiredness that had been building in his body, the long hours of the round, the weight of the years, all of it began to settle, to soften, to find a new shape. He felt his shoulders drop, his jaw unclench, his hands relax on the wood of the pole. The breath that had been held in his chest for so long, the breath that had been tight and shallow and full of the grit of the streets, began to deepen, to slow, to find a rhythm that was not a cage. He closed his eyes, not because he was falling asleep, but because the darkness felt good. It felt familiar. It felt like the river, deep and full of movement, full of the life that was carried by the current. He thought of Sarah, of her hand in his, of the way she had looked at him in the final hours. He thought of her voice, the way it had carried the words that had stayed with him, the words he had not believed until now. You will be all right. You will find your way back to the light. The light was not something he had to find. It was something he carried, and it was still burning, small and steady, in the darkness of his chest. Sleep came then, not as a fall, but as a rise. The water of the river seemed to rise, filling the air, filling the space around him, filling the hollows of his body. He felt himself floating, not on the water, but in it, suspended in the deep, dark current, and the current was warm, and the current was gentle, and the current was carrying him without effort, without resistance, without the need to know where it was going. He was not asleep, not yet, but he was no longer awake. He was in the space between, the place where the light of the day and the dark of the night meet, the place where the watch does not need to tick, where the round does not need to be walked, where the path is open and the journey is over. The bench under him was solid, but the world around him was soft, the edges blurring, the sounds merging into a single, low hum, the hum of the river, the hum of the night, the hum of his own breath, slowing, deepening, settling into the rhythm of the tide. He did not fight it. He did not hold on to the last thread of consciousness. He let go, not as a surrender, but as a release, the same release that Albert had spoken of, the same release that the pilot had described, the same release that the spring in the clock had found when it was allowed to move. The water rose over him, and he was not afraid. He was not sad. He was not alone. The current carried him, and the darkness held him, and the light in his chest burned, small and steady, like a lamp in a long, dark street. Sleep came, and it did not ask permission. It did not knock. It simply arrived, like the tide, like the dawn, like the end of a long round. And Arthur Pendleton, the lamplighter, the man who had walked through the night for 22 years, slipped into the deep, quiet, dreaming dark. The night passed, not as a series of hours, but as a single, continuous movement, a slow current that carried Arthur through the dark. He did not dream, or if he did, the dreams were soft and formless, like the light of a lamp seen through fog, distant and warm, without shape or substance. He lay on the bench, his body still, his breath slow, his coat pulled tight around him against the chill of the river air. The watch in his pocket ticked, but he did not hear it. The water lapped against the dock, but he did not hear it. The wind moved through the bare branches of the trees, but he did not hear it. He was in a place beyond sound, beyond time, beyond the round that had held him in its rhythm for so long. The river kept its own time, the slow, patient time of the tide, the time of the moon and the stars, the time of the water that had been flowing since before the city was built, since before the lamps were lit, since before the first man walked the streets. The river did not hurry. It did not count the minutes. It simply moved, and the night moved with it, and Arthur moved with the night, carried by the same current that had carried the pilot, the same current that had carried the ships, the same current that would carry all things to the sea. The hours passed, and the darkness began to thin, the deep black of the night softening into a gray, the gray into a pale, the pale into the first hint of light. The stars faded, one by one, and the sky above the river turned from black to blue, from blue to the faint, silver glow of the approaching dawn. Arthur stirred, but he did not wake. The sleep was deep, the kind of sleep that comes after a long journey, after a long night, after a long round, and it held him in its embrace, reluctant to let him go. The first birds began to sing, a thin, tentative song, the sound of a robin, then a blackbird, then a chorus of small voices that rose from the trees and the hedges and the rooftops. The river began to stir, the surface catching the first light of the day, the ripples turning from gray to gold. A barge horn sounded in the distance, a low, mournful note, and the sound carried across the water, through the mist, through the quiet, and Arthur heard it, though he did not wake. The sound became part of his sleep, part of the current, part of the long, slow movement of the night that was passing into day. The lamp at the foot of the bridge had burned low, the flame small and weak, the oil nearly spent. It would need to be refilled, to be cleaned, to be tended to, before the next night fell. But for now, it burned on, a small, stubborn point of light in the gray of the morning, a reminder of the promise that had been made, the promise that the light would always be carried, that the dark would always be a gift, that the path would always be open. Arthur slept, and the night passed, and the river flowed, and the world turned, slow and steady, towards the light. The dawn came fully, at last, the sun rising above the rooftops of the city, casting long, golden rays across the water, across the dock, across the bench where Arthur lay. The light was warm, gentle, the kind of light that comes only in the early morning, before the city has fully woken, before the noise and the hurry and the dust of the day have begun. Arthur opened his eyes slowly, the light filtering through his lashes, the sounds of the morning reaching him in fragments, the cry of a gull, the clatter of a cart, the distant whistle of a train. He did not move at first. He lay still, his body heavy, his mind quiet, the sleep still clinging to him like the mist that hung over the river. He was cold, but not unpleasantly so. The chill of the night had settled into his coat, into his boots, into the bench under him, but the warmth of the sun was beginning to seep through, a slow, patient warmth that promised to drive the cold away. He sat up, slowly, his joints aching, his muscles stiff from the night on the bench. He looked at the river, and he saw that the water was different. It was no longer the dark, deep, moving water of the night. It was bright, alive, the surface of the river catching the light in 1,000 small points, like 1,000 small lamps, each one burning with its own steady flame. He reached into his pocket and he felt the watch. He pulled it out, held it in his palm, and looked at the face. The hands had moved, The watch was still ticking, still keeping the time, still doing the work it had been made to do. He held it to his ear, and he listened to the ticking, the small, steady rhythm that had been with him through the night, through the round, through the long, slow turn of the hours. And he thought of Albert, of the clockmaker's workshop, of the words that had opened a path in his chest. The energy is still there. It just needs a way to move again. He stood, his legs unsteady, his head light. He picked up his pole, shouldered his satchel, and looked at the river, at the light, at the city that was waking around him. The round was over, the night was done, and he was still here, still standing, still carrying the light. He did not know where he would go. He did not know if he would return to the flat on Long Lane, or if he would find a new place, a new round, a new way of being in the world. But he knew, with a certainty that was quiet and deep, that the path was open and that he was walking through it. He tucked the watch into his pocket, and he began to walk, not towards the next lamp, but towards the light, towards the warmth, towards the morning that was waiting for him, full of possibility, full of the promise of the day. The river flowed on, and the lamps stood ready, and the city stirred, and Arthur Pendleton, the lamplighter, walked into the dawn, his steps light, his heart quiet, the small, steady flame of the night still burning in his chest. And the sun rose, and the day began, and the round was complete.